Welcome to week 2 of Module 1. This week we're going to continue with the theme of reflection, but this time I want you to try to challenge a common misconception about talents and abilities, about where our particular talents and skills come from. So are you the person you are because of things that you inherited from your parents, or because of the place you grew up? Are you shaped by your genes or by your environment? In this section, we're going to take a look at the people and the places that helped you become the person you are today. So if you remember, we started this module with the question, why am I here? Well, this week, we're going to ask you, well, why the person that you are? Now, I understand that questions like this are delving into all sorts of philosophical and religious territories, so apologies if I tread on your own personal beliefs. That's not my intention at all. I think the explanation I present here sits very comfortably with all beliefs, except perhaps astrology, and I say that as a typical Scorpio. So I want you just to look at this picture of a famous person as a child with his grandfather. Can you tell who the child is based on his grandfather's features? Pause the video while you take a look and see if you can guess who the child is based on the grandfather's features. Well done if you spotted that it's Barack Obama. We often share features with our parents or siblings, like a nose or ears, eyes or hair. These are the result of genetics. But many people believe that the things we are good at are like the way we look, that they too are inherited. Many professional musicians, actors or artists have relatives who were also similarly talented. Beethoven and Mozart both came from musical families, for example. But is this evidence that talent and skill are passed on through our genes? There's a long history of children going into their mother's or father's line of work. Doctors, teachers, miners, police, soldiers. Maybe there's a tradition in your family of people going into the same line of work as their parents. This photograph shows the Baldwin brothers, who are all actors. Now, they're no relation to me, I should say. So this idea, this tendency for people to go into the same line of business as people in their family suggests a genetic link, doesn't it? So how do you explain Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci? Michelangelo's father was a banker and then a civil servant, and Da Vinci's worked in law. But both these children were apprenticed to artists, and so were trained to be artists, rather than born to be artists. What about Isaac Newton or Stephen Hawking, both Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge? Well, Newton came from a family of farmers, but he had an uncle who was able to recommend him for study at the University of Cambridge. However, Hawking's parents were Oxford graduates, and his father was a medical researcher. Usain Bolt's parents ran a grocery store. They weren't Olympic athletes. So of those three, Newton, Hawking and Bolt, only Stephen Hawking seems to have ended up doing something similar to his parents. He's a scientist. But Hawking is also an example of something we know well. If your parents went to university, you're more likely to go to university too. You're also more likely to grow up with lots of books around you and hearing conversations about things like politics or science. Newton got his place at Cambridge through family recommendation. But both Newton and Hawking became great mathematicians through education and practice. not because they inherited mathematical ability. And Bolt became good at athletics because he grew up playing cricket and football and was, as many young boys are, obsessed with sport. In other words, he got good through practice as well. He was also likely encouraged by others, perhaps by his parents, by his friends. So just as if you grow up in a home where education is seen as important, you're more likely to be educated yourself, then if you grow up in a home where music is heard or played, and particularly if there's a piano available, then you're more likely to grow up to be musical than if you grow up somewhere without access to music. Beethoven's father was a court musician and ensured his son was trained and employed to be a musician as well. If his father had been a miner, Beethoven would probably have been a miner. Mozart's father famously took him and his sister, also a precocious musician, on tours of Europe to show off his talents. But talent, according to some, is nothing without training, or, more specifically, practice. The sociologist Richard Sennett says in his book The Craftsman that successful writers, composers, artists, and even basketball players become successful because they devote 10,000 hours, at least 3 hours a day for 10 years, to practice. No amount of natural talent will overcome a lack of practice, but practice can overcome a lack of talent. Now, although there's still a lot of debate about whether skills and talents are passed down from generation to generation, it seems more likely that our attitudes and abilities are the product of our environment or the way we were brought up, hence nurture rather than nature. So why is this important? Well, the reason I've spent all this time making this point is actually really simple. This module is about you. And if you agree with me that you're the product of your environment, then to understand yourself, you need to take a look at your environment. And by that, I don't so much mean the countryside or the town, but the people in it. I'm aware that for a lot of you, your project is the result of you trying to fix something that's wrong with where you live. But what about the positive elements? Are there any? In particular, the crowd of people that make up your community, your town or village, your school or neighbourhood, or your circle of friends. Those people and their attitudes towards you, towards everything, affect you, positively or negatively. I mentioned earlier that Newton got into Cambridge because of his uncle, that Mozart and Beethoven were encouraged in their music by family tradition. Barack Obama praises his upbringing in nurturing a desire to help others, which led him to study law, then teach, and then enter politics. So who encouraged you? Was it a particular teacher, a friend, a neighbour, a family member, a complete stranger? This encouragement could be explicit, or it could be more subtle. For example, perhaps they inspired you by their approach to life, or their quiet faith in you. What I'm getting at here is less about identifying someone who has given you practical help, but who has in some way nurtured you, whether they know it or not. So I'm going to suggest some ways for you to think about this, and I'm going to give you a choice. You might only want to focus on one of these choices, and that's fine. It's quality, not quantity, that counts. Remember, the theme of the module is all about you. The aim of the activities is to make you think about what or who helped shape you to be the person you are. So the first option is for you to interview some key people from your life. You can do this through text, through video, through audio. So identify some people or a person who has been particularly influential. And as I say, not through practical means, but through nurture, through the way they behave, their philosophy in life, the way that they welcome people into their home, the way that they are a centre of focus for the local community. So it could be someone who runs the local shop, for example. It could be, it could be anybody. I want you to interview them. So that means arranging to have a chat with them, sit down with them, and just talk to them. You don't need to write down a list of questions beforehand, but you might write down some ideas for the topics you want to talk about. And just have a chat, a conversation, and then record it in some way, either through writing notes and then writing up the notes later, or you might video your discussion and then edit bits of it together, or you might record it just as audio only and then edit that together if you know how. The second option is to identify the key figures in your community. So again, these might be people who run the local community centre, who run a local place of worship, who organise after-school activities, perhaps. People in your community who help to give that community a sense of cohesion, a sense of philosophy of life. And what I'd like you to do is to create what we call a pen portrait of them. So this is a description in words of that person and what it is about the way they behave that you think has had an effect on you. You may talk to them, you may do it from memory, you may photograph them and include that photograph with your pen portrait, you may do a drawing. But the idea here is for you to put things into your words, whereas the first option is about using their words. Activity 3 is a good one if you're not particularly keen on talking in depth to people, or the people you want to talk to aren't around. I'd like you to create a visual tour of your community. That means taking photographs or maybe doing a video, taking us around your community and pointing out the important places to you, but also the important places to other people in the community. So, for example, where I was growing up in a city called York in England, around the corner from me was the local Salvation Army headquarters. Now, I didn't go to the Salvation Army to worship each Sunday, but the Salvation Army had a huge effect on the local community. Sometimes they would come and play music. They had a brass band. They would come and play music outside our houses, which was nice. But they also took in homeless people and gave them clothes and gave them things to eat. And so our local community had a community of homeless people who would come through to go to the Salvation Army. So even though I personally didn't use the Salvation Army, it had an effect on me. And sometimes I have a think about this, and I think it affected the way I think of homelessness and of people who are down on their luck, who have had personal tragedies or circumstances that have affected them negatively. And so that has had an effect on me, and I think it had an effect on my community. So if I were doing a tour of my community and I was still living there, I would include the Salvation Army headquarters, even though it wasn't somewhere that I went, but it was a part of the community. Okay, so think quite broadly here about what places in your community have had an effect on you. And the more broadly you think about it, the more it might reveal that places you don't actually use or don't actually visit do have an effect on the people around you, and that has an effect on you. And the fourth activity is to create an illustrated family tree. Now, you've probably seen family trees, so you know what they basically are. So you've got you and your brothers and sisters, if you have any, on one level, and above that you've got your parents and their brothers and sisters, and above that you've got their parents and their brothers and sisters, and see how far back you can go just from using people's memories. So, for example, if your grandparents are still alive, you can talk to your grandparents and see how far back their memories go of who their parents were, who their grandparents were. Write that down, sketch that down on a piece of paper, and then try to see if you can find photographs or other images that show these people, or maybe just represent them. So, for example, if your great-great-grandfather was, a teacher, you might not have a photograph of that person, but you might be able to represent it in some way. But in doing it, try and figure out if the people in your family tree have influenced further generations. So even though you've probably, undoubtedly never met your great-great-great-grandfather, his behaviour, his philosophy on life, whether positive or negative, could have had an effect on you. So I hope you enjoy these activities. They're meant actually to be quite fun to do, but sometimes asking questions like this can be difficult if the events that shaped you are not happy ones. So please don't do anything you'd rather not do. I'd also strongly suggest that you do this activity with a friend or family member if you can, as they may help you interpret what you find out or ask useful questions that you hadn't thought about. So where should you post the results? Well, if you want to celebrate these people and these places, then post them to YouTube or on your blog or website if you have one. You could tell us about your important people on Facebook, or you could keep it private, something just for you. So you don't have to share this. I'd like you to do at least one of the activities, but you can keep it entirely private to you. What you do will be used later on. So this isn't like doing homework where somebody's going to have a look at it, and if you don't do it, you're going to get told off. That's not the case at all. But you can keep this private, and a lot of you may wish to for lots and lots of different reasons. What's important here is what you get out of it. So I hope this week's video has made you think differently about how you got to where you are. That if you thought that your talents, your skills, your abilities were the result of genetics, that maybe now you're thinking, well, perhaps not so much. I think we're all the result of the environment we grew up in, the people, the places, the general mood of a community, the general attitude of people towards other people. And those attitudes could be good, they could be bad, but they affect you, either because you grew up with the same attitudes, or maybe because you grew up rebelling against those attitudes. However you respond to this week's activities, this week's suggestions, I look forward to looking at what you produce, and as ever, I'll be here for questions, and we'll have a couple of Twitter chats this week. Please have fun, and enjoy.